Hey everyone. Today I bring you a long, detailed story that will make you shiver. Imagine living in front of a cemetery and starting to witness things that simply have no explanation. This is the account of someone who lived through this frightening experience. If you love stories full of mystery and tension, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and get ready to dive into this dark tale. Now, let's jump into the story. Chapter 1. The Move. When I moved into this house, I never imagined what was waiting for me. I was looking for peace, a place where I could disconnect from the world and find some tranquility. The little town where I ended up was perfect for that, remote, with only a few hundred inhabitants, surrounded by forests and fields. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the worries of the modern world couldn't penetrate. The house itself was charming. Not very large, but cozy, with a wooden porch that offered a wide and serene view. The only detail that might be considered strange by some was the cemetery right in front. A low, old wall separated it from the street, and I could see the tombstone stretching as far as the eye could see. For me, this wasn't a problem. I grew up hearing ghost stories and hauntings, but I never took any of it seriously. After all, the dead don't harm anyone, right? The first few days were exactly what I expected. Peaceful, calm, almost bucolic. I spent my time exploring the small town, getting to know some neighbors who were friendly but very reserved. It was obvious they were used to a life without much novelty, and the arrival of an outsider like me sparked some curiosity. However, the cemetery was a topic no one seemed to want to discuss. Whenever I mentioned its location or asked about it, people quickly changed the subject or simply made an excuse to end the conversation. I found that strange, but didn't give it much thought at the time. Chapter 2. The beginning of the noises. The calm lasted until the third week. It was on a particularly silent night when the first sounds began. I was lying in bed, almost falling asleep when I heard something that made me wake up immediately. They were footsteps. Slow but heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking around the house in boots sinking into the wet earth. I lay there, listening carefully, trying to identify the direction they were coming from. The footsteps seemed to move around the house methodically, as if the person was circling the perimeter. I got up, heart racing, and went to the window. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale light over the cemetery and the deserted street. I waited but saw nothing. I opened the window to listen better, and for a moment, the footsteps stopped. The silence was so absolute that I could hear my own heart beating. I stayed there for a few minutes, but when the cold began to bother me, I decided to close the window and go back to bed. I convinced myself it must have been some animal, maybe a dog wandering around at night. Still, it took me longer than usual to fall asleep. The next night, the footsteps returned. This time, they started earlier, around 11 p.m. I was in the living room, watching TV when I heard the sound coming from outside, from the cemetery side. I turned off the TV and stayed quiet, trying to catch every detail. The footsteps seemed slower, as if the person was dragging their feet. I felt a chill down my spine. Who could be walking there at that hour? I went out onto the porch, trying to see in the dark. But like the night before, there was no one there. The situation repeated itself over the next few nights, always at the same time, always with the same intensity. No matter how hard I tried to see or hear better, I could never identify the source of the footsteps. They were just there, like an invisible presence that circled my house, never revealing itself. I started to feel uneasy, but still tried to remain logical. There had to be an explanation, maybe someone was passing by every night, but then why couldn't I see anyone? Chapter 3. The First Apparition. It was on a full moon night that things really started to spiral out of control. I was at home, reading a book, trying to distract myself from recent events, when I felt an inexplicable urge to look out the window. It was as if something was calling me, an almost physical sensation pulling me towards the glass. I went to the living room window, which faced the cemetery, and opened the curtains. The moonlight illuminated the tombstones with a ghostly intensity, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. That's when I saw something that made my heart almost stop. In the middle of the tombstones, there was a figure. It was standing, motionless, wrapped in a dark cloak that covered its entire body. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. It was a strange feeling, as if its gaze was penetrating me, even from that distance. I stood there, not knowing what to do. The figure didn't move, it just watched me. My instinct told me to run, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. I tried to blink, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I opened them again, the figure was still there, motionless, sinister. Finally, I gathered the courage to close the curtains and step away from the window. My body was trembling, and I could barely think straight. Who, or what, could that be? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Part of me wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but another part knew it was real. In the morning, I went out and walked to the cemetery, hoping to find some clue, maybe footprints in the dirt, but there was nothing. The place was empty, peaceful, as always. The only thing different was the strange feeling that I wasn't alone, even under the sunlight. Chapter 4. The Voice in the Darkness. After that night, I started noticing other strange things in the house. It was as if the air had gotten heavier, filled with an energy I couldn't explain. And then, one night, I heard the voice. It was a whisper, low and almost inaudible, but enough to make me freeze. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the voice was distinct. It was calling my name, slowly and drawn out, as if coming from a tired throat. The sound seemed to come from inside the house, which made my blood run cold. I got out of bed and started walking around the house, trying to locate the source. Each room was colder than normal, and the silence was almost deafening. When I reached the living room, the whisper stopped. I stood still, listening, but all I could hear was my heart pounding in my chest. From that night on, the voice became a constant presence. No matter where I was in the house, I could hear it calling my name. Sometimes it was as if it was in the next room, other times, it seemed to be right behind me. What scared me the most was the fact that no matter how hard I tried to find it, I could never identify where it was coming from. It was as if the whole house was whispering to me. I started avoiding being home alone at night, but it was impossible to ignore what was happening. I knew something was deeply wrong, but I still refused to believe it could be something supernatural. I tried to distract myself, invite friends over, but no one wanted to stay in the house for long. Everyone said the place had a strange energy, and that only increased my discomfort. Chapter 5. The Waking Nightmare. As the days went by, my mental health began to deteriorate. The constant state of alertness and sleepless nights were wearing me down. I could barely eat, and the exhaustion was evident in every part of my body. It was on one of those nights, when I finally fell asleep, that I had the worst nightmare of my life. Or at least, I thought it was a nightmare. I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was watching me. When I opened my eyes, I saw a dark shadow in the corner of the room. It wasn't an ordinary shadow, it looked dense, almost solid, and it was moving towards me. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. The shadow kept getting closer until I felt its weight on me, as if it was trying to suffocate me. I lay there, unable to move or scream, while the shadow pressed me against the bed. My vision began to darken, and I thought it was the end. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The shadow disappeared, and I was able to move again. I sat up in bed, breathing heavily, my body drenched in cold sweat. I spent the rest of the night awake, with the light on, trying to understand what had just happened. In the days that followed, I continued to have these sleep paralysis episodes, but each time they felt more real. The shadow returned every night, always in the same corner of the room, and each time it approached faster. I knew I needed to do something, but I didn't know where to start. It seemed like the house was trying to drive me out, or worse, that something inside it wanted to possess me. Chapter 6. The Discovery. After weeks of facing the unknown, I decided I needed to understand what was happening. I went to the local library and started researching the history of the town and, more specifically, the area where my house was located. I discovered that before the cemetery was built, that land was considered a cursed place by the old inhabitants. There are records of ancient rituals and stories of mysterious disappearances. I spoke to some of the older residents, and they confirmed what I had found. They said that the area where the cemetery was built was a place of negative energy, and that the town had decided to build the cemetery there to seal the evil that inhabited the place. My house, it seems, was built very close to this evil. The stories varied, but they all had one thing in common: that place was not safe. One of the oldest residents told me that many years ago, even before he was born, there was a series of strange events in that area. People started disappearing without a trace, and animals were found dead in grotesque ways. That's when the town decided to build the cemetery, hoping that the disturbed spirits inhabiting the land would find peace. However, it seems that never happened. This discovery left me even more disturbed. I knew something was wrong from the beginning, but now I had confirmation that my house was connected to something much older and more powerful than I could have imagined. I felt like I was being dragged into a never-ending nightmare, and I didn't know how to get out. Chapter 7. The Invasion. After discovering the history of the place, things got drastically worse. What were once just apparitions and noises became a full-blown invasion. Each night brought new terrors. The lights in the house began flickering without explanation, objects moved on their own, and I could feel a constant presence around me, as if I was being watched all the time. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. I left the room with a knife in my hand, my heart pounding, expecting to find someone. But when I got to the hallway, it was empty. However, the air was cold, and there was an oppressive feeling that made me tremble from head to toe. I heard a loud knock on the front door, so loud it made the walls shake. I ran to the door and opened it forcefully, but there was no one there. The silence outside was absolute, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. From that night on, the phenomena intensified. The footsteps in the hallway became more frequent, and sometimes I could hear whispers coming from all around, as if the walls were full of voices. The doors in the house would slam shut on their own, and the windows would open and close violently, even with no wind. I started locking all the doors and windows before going to sleep, but that didn't stop the occurrences. I was being cornered in my own house, and the feeling of despair grew every day. I started feeling like my sanity was slipping away, that I couldn't resist much longer. It was as if the house was alive, and I was just an intruder in its domain. Chapter 8. The Walls Collapse. It was on a stormy night that the wall separating my house from the cemetery finally gave way. The rain was torrential, and the thunder made the house tremble. I was in the living room, trying to ignore the sounds, when I heard a deafening crash from outside. I ran to the porch and saw that the wall had collapsed, leaving a direct opening to the cemetery. The sight was terrifying. The gravestones seemed closer than ever, and among them, I saw shadows moving. They weren't people, at least not living people. The figures I saw were distorted, almost transparent, but somehow I knew they were coming towards me. The fear paralyzed me, and for a moment, I couldn't do anything but watch those shadows advance in my direction. When I finally managed to move, I ran inside the house and locked the door. But I knew the protection was useless. The shadows were outside, and it was only a matter of time before they got in. The sound of thunder mixed with the noise of something scratching the walls, as if they were trying to break in by force. I stood with my back to the door, holding a knife, trying to prepare for the worst, but the fear was overwhelming. The hours dragged on that endless night. The sound of scratching and banging only stopped at dawn, when the sunlight finally began to illuminate the house. When I opened the door and went out, I saw that the cemetery was silent, as if nothing had happened. But the wall was still destroyed, and the shadows I had seen the night before seemed to hide deep among the gravestones, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Chapter 9. The Final Battle. After the wall's collapse, my situation became unbearable. What were once just nocturnal manifestations now haunted me day and night. The presence of the shadows in the house was almost tangible, and I could feel their hostile intentions with every step. I decided I needed to do something, anything, to ward off those entities. I spoke to an old town resident, known for his beliefs in rituals and ancient traditions. He gave me a set of instructions to perform a protection ritual, using salt, herbs, and candles. I was desperate enough to try anything. I spent the afternoon preparing everything, following every detail he had told me. When night fell, I started the ritual, circling the house with salt and chanting the words he had taught me. The candles were spread throughout the house, and I could feel the energy moving, as if it was disturbing the entities. But instead of driving them away, it seemed to enrage them. The lights began to flicker violently, and the sound of footsteps, once distant, was now inside the house, getting closer and closer. The shadows emerged from the dark corners, more numerous and more aggressive than ever. It was as if the entire house was being invaded by an invisible and deadly force. I felt like I was losing the battle, that my sanity was about to be destroyed along with the house. In the moment of greatest despair, one of the candles fell, and the fire began to spread. I grabbed the suitcase I had already prepared and ran out the door, without looking back. The fire consumed the house, but I knew the shadows would still be there, waiting for their next victim. Chapter 10. The End of the Line. I left town the next morning. I drove for hours, aimlessly, until I found a new town, where no one knew my story, and where I could start over. But the events of that house still haunt me. I can't sleep well, always expecting to hear the footsteps or whispers. The feeling of being watched has never left me, and sometimes, at night, when I'm alone, I still feel the presence of the shadows, as if they were following me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And now, I'm here, telling my story, hoping to find some peace or understanding. But deep down, I know that the evil that inhabited that house is older and more powerful than I can understand, and that, maybe, it will never really leave me alone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more horror stories. Remember, sometimes evil may be closer than we imagine. And please, stay away from old cemeteries, you never know what might be lurking.